Good evening, everyone. It's just after 7 o'clock. I make it 7:01, and I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole Budget meeting to order. Acknowledge that the meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin territories. I would like to thank the Algonquin nations for hosting this meeting on their land. So tonight, I'd like to advise the committee that the purpose of the meeting is to provide an updated financial forecast, to provide the 2021-2022 grant announcements information, to provide information on a budget item regarding priority school resource officer. And I'd like to call for a mover to approve the agenda. Trustee Boothby, thank you very much. Are there any changes to the agenda? And seeing no changes, I'd like to call the question on the agenda. All those in favor? And opposed? Thank you very much, and that passes. And I don't believe we have any delegations this evening. I don't see any on my list. So moving on our agenda to item number 4, discussion items. Item 4.1, Memo 21-045. 2020-2021 updated financial forecast. And I'd like to turn it over to the director to introduce this item. Madam Director.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Just as you've said, tonight's meeting is basically to lay the foundation for our future budget discussions. There have been a number of announcements that have come through the ministry, as well as our reconciliation from last year. And so we know the complexities of our budget this year and going into the new school year. And CFO Carson is here to bring us through that process, to look at where we've been and where we're going, the implications of the budget announcements from the ministry, and some of the directions that have gone with them to set the foundation for our future conversations. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to CFO Carson.
Thanks, Chair. And just before we begin, people will remember that we were originally scheduled to present the staff recommended budget this evening. The timing of the announcement from the ministry, as well as some of the technical changes that they've incorporated, meant that we needed one more week. We did feel it was important, though, to take advantage of this evening. As the director says, an important component of our planning is the state of our finances at the end of August 2021. And so we felt it was important to bring that to you this evening. I'm going to ask Kevin Gardner, our Manager of Financial Services, to take you through a brief presentation to highlight what's in Report 21-045 in front of you. So I'll turn it over to Kevin, and then afterwards, if there are questions, we'll be pleased to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, CFO Carson. And through you, Mr. Chair, tonight we have a Report 21-045, and I will just share my screen with everyone. And I believe this is it. So we prepared a presentation to accompany the report just to guide the discussion tonight. The report is very similar to the ones that have been received in the past, and it builds on the revised estimates report that had been presented in early February, outlining some of the changes to the grants and expenses. So the updated forecast is basically what we do is we look at where we're going, what our experience is up to March 31st, and try to identify any changes that are occurring during the year, and then to also forecast out to the end of the year. The projection is expecting a deficit of 18.7 million, which is an increase over what we had in the original budget. So it's a $1 million increase over that. However, in comparison to the revised estimates, it is a significant reduction of close to $10 million. So that's a positive reflection, and that has a positive impact on our accumulated surplus, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. Very briefly about the accumulated surplus. So this particular slide shows where some historic information over the past few years. At times we will have a deficit, and sometimes we have a surplus. That a surplus increases the resources available in our accumulated surplus. Well, a deficit will draw down on that balance. And it's important because we use the accumulated surplus to balance our budget. And it is basically a reserve that, similar to having money in the bank, that we can use to meet the needs of students. So in this case, the $18.7 million deficit will result in a reduction of our accumulated surplus, so that at the end of the year, we'd only have about $21 million available in our accumulated surplus that's available for compliance. However, of that $21 million, just over $9 million is committed to support the amortization expenses related to certain capital projects. So in reality, we only have about $12 million available to us. Some of the significant items, and I'll speed up the presentation here. Some of the significant items are reduced enrollment that we've experienced this year. It has resulted in a close to $17 million reduction in revenues that are student-based, ADE-based. And that's really many of the different allocations that make up the grants for student needs. We do have other adjustments. We have more individuals or students participating in Indigenous studies, and that generates some revenue that goes towards supporting our costs. We do have increased funding related to teacher qualifications and experience, and there's two parts to that. It's higher funding representing teacher demographics. So the way the ministry funds the district is that they provide a benchmark, and then they also provide supplemental funding should a salary be in excess of the benchmark, or it may also work the other way. If for some reason our benchmark or our demographics be lower than the benchmark, they may reduce some of the funding. But in this particular case, we are getting some increased funding there, and they're also providing a supplemental funding for the benefit costs that we are incurring on behalf of the employees. We are going to be taking in some extra funding, close to $4 million from the MTCA funding. What MTCA funding is they look at the grants for student needs, and we set aside 2% of the amount, or up to 2% of the amount, to acquire computer equipment, furniture, fixtures, anything that can be used over a length of several years. And that particular funding may, if it's not used for capital, it gets redirected to the operating budget to support operating costs, non-specific operating costs generally. And so that what we've been able to do is identify opportunities to fund some of the capital equipment through different means, and that has freed up some of the MTCA money for use in the operating budget. And we're also looking at some decreased transportation funding, reflecting savings on fuel costs during periods of remote learning. And the way the ministry looks at that is that we're not incurring the same fuel charges because we're not running the buses. So they're doing a clawback. And this number, given the length of this most recent closure, will increase somewhat, but our costs will also reflect some savings. We did get priorities and partnerships funds grants. They reflect significantly that loss of revenue in the GSNs as a result of the enrollment decrease has actually provided some opportunity for the ministry to provide supplemental funding. They call it stabilization funding. And what it was intended to do is actually put the district back into a position so that it assumes that our budgeted enrollment is what we would have received from the funding that we are with this 14.4 million. As you recall from an earlier slide, it was about $16 million decrease in enrollment-driven funding, and they're providing 14.4 in supplemental funding to offset that decrease. There's also new funding to meet COVID-related needs, such as ventilation, remote learning, and the additional teachers. And that's close to 17 million. And then there's other PPF grants. Those are what we call non-COVID related PPF grants. And they support things such as French as a second language, autism, additional qualifications. And there's a full list of all the grants in the report as Appendix D. Just a little bit more information on the COVID-related funding. As you can see, we do have significant funds coming in. We show the amount that was originally embedded in our budget, close to $5.4 million. The revised estimates, which I've included in this chart for comparative purposes, during that part, or prior to preparation of the revised estimates, the ministry provided additional funding to meet COVID-related needs. And that boosted these particular grants up to $33 million. And then for the revised forecast, since the revised estimates, the forecast is now projecting $40 million of COVID funding, COVID-related funding. And of that 40 million, and close to 3.8 million will be used to acquire computer equipment. And we, as I mentioned, it interacts with the minor tangible capital assets funding, and that is a contributing factor to our ability to use to bring in more operating funding from the MTCA allocation. Significant items. So some of the other significant items is increased spending on instructional supports, teachers, school office staff. There's also increased spending on lunchtime monitors for supervision, et cetera. We did increase the provision for occasional teacher costs. However, that is down from the revised estimates. During periods of remote closure or remote learning, we generally see less utilization of sick leave or other absences. However, and so we'll be reviewing that as we go forward to the end of the year. Decrease in overall cost of supplies and services. We actually, this is a common thing that we do see. It does relate to our minor intangible capital assets and how we classify certain expenses as whether they're operating or capital. So an amount may be budgeted in the operating budget, but actually be moved over to the capital side of it. Student transportation costs, significant savings there, 7.1 million. And that's the result of lower transportation contract costs as a result of remote learning, reduced in use of the yellow buses, and also lower use of transit passes. From the facilities perspective, the COVID grants have provided additional capacity to provide enhanced cleaning of the schools, and our forecast projects an increase of $2.4 million spending there, and that's supported by the COVID-related grants. Similarly, the COVID-related safety supplies, equipment, and ventilation is adding $5.2 million. And a lot of that is in various grants that will be fully spent by the end of the year. Safety supplies, that would be masks, hand sanitizer, partitions on desks, etc. We also are seeing increased spending on portable relocations as our demographics change across the region. We have growth. We do need to move portables around, and so that is one of the costs. And similarly, our school renewal investments are expected to exceed the budget. I believe it's by about $1.3 million. And The school renewal is an interesting one because they provide a grant. It's roughly around 15 million, but it's split between capital and operating. And the operating portion is capped at 5.1 million. So if we exceed the spending on that 5.1 million, it really draws against other funding that we receive from an operating perspective. And then there's some other operational savings within the facilities area. Some of the challenges to relate to reduced revenues. One is the reduced community use of schools with the inability to actually rent out gymnasiums, for instance. We experience lower revenues of $1 million. We also had an assumption in our budget that we were going to receive over $3 million in a refund of a benefit surplus from a former benefit plan that was operated prior to the, I guess, a centralized employee life and health trust for all the employee groups. The central agreements that were recently negotiated resulted in a different cost sharing split, and therefore, or funding split basically, and we're not going to be receiving the $825,000. So that $825,000 will instead be directed to the Employee Life and Health Trust, and we'll be left with about 3.4 or 2.4 million. We also, as a result of the pandemic, have lower international student enrollment, and our administrative fees and revenues are both down as a result of that lower enrollment. And one of the more significant items is we have increased extraordinary costs relating to the provision of legal claims. So this is a net increase on that line of $2.2 million. And that's just a provision for a number of outstanding legal claims that we've identified. We do have some other revenue decreases totaling 1.7 million. And one of the areas there is we do budget for miscellaneous revenues, and we increase our budget of that particular line, even though we know that the revenue will be assigned to different operational areas. So this is really just a significant part of it is an adjustment to recognize that those miscellaneous revenues have been assigned to other areas within the overall revenue budgets. One of the significant loss of revenues is in the extended day and childcare programs. That's where we're projecting a $5.8 million operating deficit. The extended day program, and particularly the extended day program, has taken a significant hit as a result of the pandemic with lower enrollment. And we've also had a decision to continue on employing the staff in those areas because it's an integrated delivery model between the extended day and our full day kindergarten program. So however, the way that the costing model works is not all costs are directed back to the board operations. So, but on the positive note, we're continuing to look at revenue opportunities to offset that deficit. Last year, we did receive funding from the ministry through the City of Ottawa to offset the deficit. And so we're hopeful that we're going to also receive additional funding this particular year. And I would hope that that $5.8 million is substantially reduced, if not eliminated. So in summary, we were looking at an $18.7 million operating deficit. It will reduce the amount of accumulated surplus that we have available to support the upcoming budget. And of this, the amount, if you recall, we had about $21 million projected available at the end of the year. However, over $9 million of that is committed. So it really does reduce the flexibility that we have. The last slide is really related to the next part of it, because the forecast really flows into the budget development as a result of knowing where we are today, and where it informs where we're thinking of what's going to be happening in 21, 22, and also influences, as I mentioned, the accumulated surplus, which is our reserves. So the scheduled budget dates, several have passed. We've had a number of meetings, including the academic staffing approval, which commits about 60% of the operating budget as part through the approval of the academic staffing, teachers, and the school leadership positions. Tonight we're going to be discussing the GSN information, and not only that, just the planning information that the district has received from the ministry. We will be presenting the staff recommended budget on June 1st. And then we'll also be looking to have several meetings after that on June 9th, public delegations, and we'll commence our budget debate, and then that'll continue on the 15th. So I'm sure CFO Carson will have more to say on the schedule here. But with that, I'd like to turn it back to CFO Carson if he has any additional comments, or we can open up for questions.
Chair, just Kevin's done a great job. There's just 2 or 3 things I do want to discuss. We recognize that the timing, that there may be a requirement to put some supplemental nights into that budget schedule. The ministry is back to the regular approval schedule, in that we are required to submit an approved budget by the end of June. And so that is the schedule we have developed. If there is a need for additional nights, we will try to accommodate that, but we'll know that better after we, as a group, have had a discussion to look at the staff recommended budget. The 2 things I wanted to highlight, though, with respect to the deficit that we've identified, we have referred to the deficit that arises because of the extended day program. One of the reasons we've identified that separately should not be seen as any lack of support for the program, just the opposite. As recently as this morning, we were working with ministry staff, identifying again the key nature of that program as part of the board's overall strategy, and secondly, as a key victim of the pandemic, and that it will be essential that the board receive financial relief for that program for much as we did last year for the current year, and looking forward to next year, because we believe that there probably will be some time before the program returns to full enrollment. So I just want to make it clear that even though we have seen that deficit, the staff recommended budget is not going to be looking at significantly reducing or eliminating the nature of that program in order to bring the deficit down. The final, and I think when we look at that, there will still be some year-end work. We have continued to work with the grants that the province has provided us. As always, our goal is to make sure that those specific grants, time-limited grants, are the first ones that are used to preserve as much of our surplus as we can. And so it may be that our deficit at the year end would be somewhat lower than it is now. Having said that, that was the forecast that we prepared at the end of March. We are comfortable that it isn't necessarily misleading. And we had the discussion again with the ministry today. It isn't anyone's benefit to be too optimistic, and we will take that into account as we're developing our budget recommendations to you. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I think we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you very much, CFO Carson. And I'm going to open the floor up to questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question. Since we're in committee, it's 3 minutes per speaker. Mr. Heidecker.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Wolf Heidecker from OCDSB. I have a 3-part question, and it concerns the ventilation that was mentioned in the report. First of all, there are two different amounts. I believe Mr. Gardner mentioned an amount of 5.2 million. Yet if I look in the report under number 11 on page 7, it says 3.4 million to enhance classroom ventilation. So my first question is, which amount is it? The second one is, Mr. Gardner mentioned that the spending would be completed by the end of the year. Just wondering how they can guarantee that. And then my third part is, Dr. Etches mentioned today that schools should reopen in Ottawa, but on the condition that ventilation is improved. And does the board know whether spending this money is going to make the schools safe enough for students to return?
Chair, just before Kevin sort of sorts out that reconciling item, I think it's important to note that the OCDSB has received a number of streams of funding through the province towards additional work on ventilation. So there, for example, was one piece that was received early in the year based on that initial announcement, which allowed us to proceed with the purchase of close to 800 of the portable HEPA filtration machines, which were deployed to schools. There was a further amount that was announced in January, but the province required us to participate in a provincial procurement plan. There's another 450 machines that were to be delivered by now. When those are received, they will be deployed to schools immediately. So those amounts we are comfortable can be expended fully by August 31st. In addition, there are other programs that are being financed by the federal government through the CVRIS is the initials. I forget all of the words, but it's the federal government's infrastructure program. And we received about $28 million. Much of that money is going towards either additional ventilation work, improvements to the school to limit the number of touch points. So we're putting in more automated doors, and also increasing the number of water bottle filling stations. So there's a variety of work. That work is to be completed by the end of December. Currently, school boards have pointed out that the availability of trades could have an impact. As to Dr. Etch's comments, the key is, the public, we've worked very closely with public health. We are following all of the guidelines from ASHRAE in terms of air exchanges and ventilation in the school buildings. And so we are confident that we are meeting those standards and will be able to meet the standards that OPH is looking for should the province have a return to school in June. So, and I think when we get to that stage, that will be the meeting that we'd have more information on that in terms of the work that's being done and the steps we're taking. I'm not trying to sidestep Wolf, but I think it's sort of two topics. Kevin, maybe you could just clarify on the two amounts that we were discussing.
Yes, so thank you. So on page 19 of the presentation is Appendix B, and it identifies all the different grants that we've received for COVID for operating purposes. And CFO Carson noted that there are multiple grants, and those grants sometimes get classified under facilities or maybe under instruction. In this case, there were two ventilation grants of close to $1.7 million each. So those two were combined. And then there were some other grants that we've received for cleaning supplies, enhanced cleaning supplies. And then we also identified some funding out of other grants that were used for enhanced cleaning, the supplies side of it, such as the PPE and hand sanitizer, or the partitions that I had mentioned. So all these things work together and are contributing to that number.
Thank you. Follow-up question, if I may, Mr. Chair. Related to this, is the board contemplating any specific accommodations if the schools do open And with the heat that we've experienced in the last couple of days, I mean, I remember teaching in a classroom where it was 35 degrees in the portable, and I can't imagine doing it with PPE mask and face shield on. Are there any accommodations being thought of by the board if the schools reopen and we have a heat wave like this for teachers and for students?
I think I can begin. And again, we had a discussion with ministry staff on this topic about 2 hours ago. We had earlier in the week made the determination that should there be return to school, we would do everything we could. Members of the committee may remember there was a budget motion years ago that directed us to raise the summer set points for air conditioning to 24, 25 degrees. It was a budget measure. We had already determined that should we be returning to school, we would be lowering that number as far as we could go. One of the challenges that we will need to monitor, and we will need to look at it site by site, is what happens when you're trying to maintain that temperature at the same time as you're changing air anywhere between 4 and 6 times an hour. Those systems weren't necessarily designed to maintain that load for an extended period. So it is an area of concern that not just our school board, but all school boards have raised with the ministry and with public health, and we'll be looking for guidance from them as well. And it is a consideration we're taking seriously.
Thank you, CF Carson. Mr. Chair, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heidecker. And moving on to Trustee Huff. Trustee Huff, are you there?
Wow, that doesn't work very well when you're trying to unmute on your telephone. Just a question. Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah?
We can.
Okay. Question is this. The decision with regard to the non-community use of school, is that a local decision, or has that been under ministry guidance to suggest that we shouldn't do that? I had a communication today from a member of the community who use our space quite extensively and are hoping that there may be some room for change in that. Could I get some sort of comment about whether or not this is set hard and fast, and whether or not there is room for this to change our budget if we can possibly consider the community use of schools?
Chair, we've been looking at this on a month-by-month basis based on the provincial guidance that we were receiving, as well as Ottawa Public Health. During the course of this past school year, one of the reasons that we were limiting that public community use was simply because of the workload on our custodial staff, and we were not able to, sorry about that, we were not able to commit to that, as well as all of the orders around limiting gatherings and sports. We are currently taking a look at what the new rules could be like for the summer. The Premier did make his announcement that camps would be reopening, but we're still looking for guidance on that, so that we will be, as soon as it's practical, looking at issuing permits for community use, but we also have to do that in conjunction with the guidance we're receiving from Ottawa Public Health.
Thank you for that, CFO Carson. I will reach out to you tomorrow with details about this conversation that I had today. I'm glad that there may be some wiggle room.
Thank you very much, Trustee Huff. And we're moving on to Trustee Bell. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to follow up on the ventilation question. I think what I understood from the presentation, the material, is that we've spent 5.2 million on ventilation this year. If you could clarify if that is correct, and how much from grants have we spent on that? And then the third part of the question would be, is there additional grant money that we could have spent on ventilation this past year?
I think I'll ask Kevin to identify the grants and what we will be spending, and then I'll address the second part of your question, Trustee Bell, after that. Kevin?
Yes, thank you. So there were two specific grants for ventilation, and they were close to $1.7 million each. The first one came through during the fall, basically, and we managed to incorporate that into our revised estimates that we filed in December and presented it in February to the board and budget committee, actually. And then a subsequent $1.7 million grant was received. So in total, close to $3.4 million has been allocated to the district specifically for ventilation. We do have other grants that provided some flexibility, but they were generally directed towards compensation costs to enhance the capacity of the board to meet the needs of students and to provide enhanced cleaning and to augment remote learning and use to acquire technology. So there were different grants. Of those, I did reference, I think it was 5.2 million in the report. I'm going based on memory here, but that was related to operational supplies such as PPE, gloves, gowns, hand sanitizer, desk partitions, so many other things that are rolled up into that number. And that came from one of the other grants, not specifically the ventilation grant. So with I
think the second part of that, Chair, we have the initial grants that we received from the province were aimed to support those classrooms where we didn't have adequate ventilation and where there were concerns. And that's where the acquisition of the portable HEPA filters came in. In addition, using some of our own dollars, we did make changes in some of the classrooms with what we call unit ventilators, similar to the kinds of unit ventilators we have in portable classrooms. And those where we were able to, where the building allowed it, we were able to get those installed. In addition, the work that we are carrying out this summer under a variety of funding, whether it was the School Condition Improvement Grant, the facilities renewal, or the CVRIS funding, is aimed at improving ventilation and improving some of the large central filtration systems. Included in our own budget, work that we had already identified prior to the announcements that the province made at the end of August last year, were improved filtration and most importantly, changing in our cycles of air changes. And so one of the most effective things in our schools was to, and we followed ASHRAE is the, and I apologize, I couldn't tell you what the initials stand for, but they are the International Standard Setters for Air Quality. Their standards for COVID called for a purging of the building immediately prior to the building being occupied, air changes of approximately 6 times per hour while occupied, and purging immediately after. And so that's approximately between 2 and 3 times what your normal air changes are. So we've seen increase in operating costs, and we will be talking to the ministry about support for that. We do have schools that do not have central mechanical ventilation. Those are buildings that are not an easy fix simply because of the nature of the work that has to be done. Those are the areas where the unit systems are in place and where we focused our efforts with the portable HEPA filters. So that's there has been additional spending there, and our scheduling of the work for the summer will be subject to the availability of getting trades in. We've been letting tenders, and we've been some of the work has already been awarded, and that work will begin as soon as possible in July. So it's a multifaceted approach, and I think I hope that is sufficient for your question.
I have a couple of follow-ups. So would it be possible to get a dollar figure for what we've spent on ventilation this year, or what we plan to? And I guess the two other subset questions, I'm curious to know what other districts as well, have we gone above and beyond what other similar size districts have been spending on ventilation or not? And I guess when it comes to the evidence of where your money is best placed to upgrade the ventilation, I wonder where we go to for that evidence. I know you mentioned one organization, but does the province also say if the school doesn't have a ventilation system, spend money on that first? I'm just wondering where that sort of direction on where you get the most impact for your dollars when it comes to ventilation comes from. So how much money, other districts, and evidence?
I think I guess the first part is, yes, we can provide a summary. I think we did before, so we'll update that in one of the memos that Mr. Bradley had prepared. So we can update that and circulate that. In terms of what other districts are doing, everybody received different proportions of their grants, so that everyone is working in the same way to try to maximize the use of those grants. And different boards have had different strategies depending on the nature of their buildings. Everybody's portfolio of buildings is different, and where they focus their attention. So I don't know that we can say that we're spending any more than any less. I know that I am comfortable because of the size of our board. We have the luxury of in-house engineering staff that have been able to integrate what we're doing to improve ventilation with the work we had already done. So that has been an advantage to us. In terms of how you look at what are the best solutions, one of the challenges is if you have a school that doesn't have central mechanical ventilation, that is not $1 million fix. That one school would probably cost, by the time you did the work, provided ductwork, went through the asbestos abatement that's required, that one school is probably going to soak up anywhere between $5 and $9 million. And I say that as a round number. I think you have a school of 500-600 spaces. What you end up doing there is looking at how can you make sure that the room ventilators are working as effectively as possible. And so it's taking a look at that, taking a look at your maintenance routine. So I think that's why it's a little counterintuitive in terms of how you can respond to those buildings. And I think all boards, I know the ministry has been looking at trying to identify the effectiveness of what they've been doing and what they've asked boards to do. And I think we'll all be learning from that over the next year or two.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Carson.
Thank you very much, Trustee Bell. Moving on to Trustee Lyra.
Hello. I have a quick question about ventilation, and that is approximately how many of our buildings do have central vac systems versus are on independent units?
Mr. Chair, I was looking for that memo earlier today. I think it's about 70% are central.
Okay. And then my second question is about the Green Climate Fund that we passed into the budget last year and this year. I consider it a significant item, even if it doesn't have a large dollar value attached. And I'm wondering, have any projects been undertaken? What has happened with that money?
If I could just clarify, Chair, this is the $150,000 that we had identified.
It is.
We have disseminated dollars to the schools and suggested because we were unable to proceed with it the way we had hoped the year before, we were a little more directive this year, and we've provided schools with, for lack of a better description, a shopping list of projects that they could undertake, everything from tree planting to some other environmental initiatives. And we hope to have those dollars committed by the end of this year.
Okay, so that money will have been spent by the beginning of the next budget process, or that's the goal?
If it's not, it will be carried forward, but that has been that's been our intention.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. Moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just coming back to the ventilation question, because there are so many different funding streams, it gets very confusing. So my understanding is what staff have talked about so far has mostly been the funding that has come to us directly from the province for COVID-related purposes. But what about the share of the funds that were part of the second tranche of federal funding that came to us? Most of it was released, give or take, February this year. And we had submitted a significant list of projects with requests for funding, and a significant proportion of the projects we submitted have been approved and have to be completed originally by the end of December, and I believe that deadline has been a bit extended. But how much funding are we getting out of that federal funding, and how much? What portion of it is going to be spent to improve our school ventilation systems?
Here that is the amount that we refer to as the CVRIS. And we received approval for about $28 million worth of projects. And I believe about 2/3 of that was aimed at various ventilation work in our buildings. We hope that December 31st deadline will be extended, but we've been encouraged by the ministry to do everything we can to make sure it is complete by the end of the year.
And is there any hope that a reasonable proportion of that funding will be in fact used by the end of August?
It's for some projects, some we scheduled that they will have to occur during the fall, just because of the timelines and designs of we were unable to award any contracts till we received approval from the province and the federal government. And those approvals were received about 4 or 5 weeks ago. There are lead times involved in the projects. Having said that, we were strategic in looking at the projects that we had, and we tried to make sure they were projects that did not require as much custom work as would sometimes be required. So we're very comfortable that a large majority of those projects will be complete by December 31st. There will be some that just won't happen just because of something. I couldn't tell you which one, but when we've got that much work on the go, something will happen. As to the end of August, that's a much harder commitment to make. Again, some of the smaller work will have been completed, but where there's more, for example, if we're retrofitting an older HVAC system with a improved central filtration, that won't be finished by the end of August.
Thank you very much for that. One comment I will make, because I think it's important, that is that our facilities and maintenance staff have really done an incredible job, not just in keeping our schools clean this year, but also in moving a lot of these projects on as fast as they possibly could. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Trustee Scott. Moving on to Pat Dixon. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, CFO Carson. I have a question related to ventilation again in regard to the opening of the schools prior to the end of this school year. How many of our sites still have inadequate ventilation? In particular, the number of portables that have non-functioning air conditioning, or the schools whose ventilation it happens more frequently in the elementary panel that is not functioning adequately.
I know this is going to sound like we're avoiding the question. We have buildings. There's always going to be daily problems that evolve. We have taken advantage to review our fleet of portables. There is an ongoing portable renewal program. And so the ventilators in those portables should be up and running at this time. And so that is, I think that's an operational piece. In our other schools where rooms were determined not to have appropriate ventilation or where the ventilation could be improved, we did look at temporary portable solutions, and those are ongoing. So I know we hear from principals on a regular basis when that's identified, and maintenance staff do respond to it. So I'm not discounting your concerns, but as they arise, we are in fact responding to them. But we've tried to take advantage of having the buildings available to us for work to get caught up with some of the backlog in some of those rooms.
Thank you. Supplemental, please. Chair?
Go ahead.
I appreciate, and I do sincerely appreciate the difficulties that the board is under in addressing some of these concerns. However, from a COVID perspective, we've got children and staff in enclosed units, such as portables, where a heat factor is in place. And how can we ensure the safety when you're dealing with masks and screens in an already uncomfortable position? And Dr. Retches has said that we must be able to ensure that there is a safe return to schools.
And again, I'm not trying to avoid your question. That is the ongoing discussions we're having with Ottawa Public Health, that the director and others of us are having provincially with the ministry staff, because there are a number of issues that need to be resolved. And we have discussed some of the challenges that staff will face with the PPE that is required. And it's why we've expressed very clearly our concerns about heat and the ability of our portfolio of buildings to serve it. And I would simply say that we will be monitoring it as a district. Our health and safety staff will be involved. Our facility staff will be involved, because the safety of students and staff is paramount in all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And seeing no further questions on that budget update, I'd like to thank CFO Carson for that. And moving on to item 4.2, memo 21-0060, 2021-2022 grant announcements. Madam Director.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So as I indicated at the beginning of the meeting with my comments, a part of this meeting is about a cast backwards, but into this school year's funding, but going into next year, part of the foundational conversation is about the grant announcements and what kinds of funding we are expecting. There are a number of things that are continuing to be COVID related, and a number of areas that are speaking directly to our grants for student needs. And so we do have, because there are some departures from typical practice, we do have an overview prepared for you so that we can help to lay the foundation of understanding of what it is that the ministry has rolled out or is anticipating rolling out, as well as the rules that go with them. And so again, CFO Carson will take us through that piece, and himself and his team are prepared to respond to questions.
Thanks, Chair. And if I could ask the committee to refer to memo 21-060. In that memo, we've tried to capture the series of instructions, guidance, whatever we call it, that we've been receiving from the Ministry of Education. This year in particular has been, continues to be a challenge. Throughout February, March, and April, the province was advising school boards to plan for a normal return to school. I think we all knew it would not be a normal return, but we were being advised and notified that the sustainability funding that school boards had received, that 14 million that we received to offset the impact of declining enrollment, would not be in place. And so I think everyone in the school district community understood there would be changes coming, but it wasn't until May the 4th that the province actually committed to that. So the first memo they released was their B07 memo, and in that they announced several items. First, that they would be providing guidance in the summer months to confirm health and safety strategies. And so there continues to be some uncertainty. However, they had identified that the provision of PPE, at least for the first half of the year, would continue to be provided centrally by the province. And I think it's important to note the cost of PPE that has been supplied centrally by the province of Ontario, whether that's gowns, masks, shields, hand sanitizer, those dollars are not reflected in our financial statements, either as revenues or expenditures. They are being handled centrally. And that by itself has been, at one point, that was running on the order of close to $500,000 to $600,000 a month. The number has reduced as I think school districts and schools were able to recognize that they weren't going to be short, and orders became, there was a little less hoarding in some of our orders, or our setting aside for next month. But it is a significant cost that the ministry continues to support next year. We were told that we are expected to operate elementary schools full-time in person for our planning with cohorting, and secondary schools would use cohorting and alternate schedules to minimize student contact. We were also identified that school boards would be available to use, in addition to the regular 1% of accumulated surplus, up to a further 1% to address COVID needs, depending on the evolution of the virus and the provincial response. We then looked to the next memo, which was B08, and in that it was the detail about changes in the overall grants for student needs. I think that the key item that we saw there was that the province did say there would be up to $50 million for the entire year to support additional spending related to COVID-19. There was, however, a very large however, that the only half of that amount was in fact committed at this point. So for this board, it's about 7.7 million, and that a decision on whether or not there would be a second half of that would be resolved by the ministry, depending on the progress of the pandemic, the state of vaccination, and determinations of needs in schools at that time. One of the challenges that creates for us is that, for example, if we choose to use some of those dollars for staffing, in some cases, we can staff temporarily. And if the ministry doesn't provide the money beyond January, then we just eliminate that additional staffing. That doesn't work in all of our categories and is not in line with our various collective agreements. So that will create some challenges for us as we move forward. Overall, I think the grants for student needs were about what we had expected. There were dollars that were being provided to support the increased compensation. And as I often say, you never receive exactly additional funding to cover all of those costs, but it certainly was an attempt to mirror the increase of the additional cost of collective agreements. There were changes to funding, enhanced right in the GSNs to support additional student-focused technology, recognizing that the practice that we've seen this year will need to continue for certain students, and that normal school district spending on technology will have to accelerate to account for equipment that has been deployed to students and may not come back, or it may not come back in a functioning state and will require replacement. So we will be receiving additional dollars for that, and that will be part of our recommended budget. There are, as always, changes to grants where they are being moved into or out of the GSN and the partnership and priorities funds, and we're working our way through it. I think we identified in the memo, school condition improvement funding continues to be strong for our district. It's about 40 million, school renewal about 15 million. And so if we take that $55 million plus whatever new dollars may come from further infrastructure announcements by different levels of government, it will be another busy year. And as I've stated before, one of the challenges that we face here in Ottawa is that with the large degree of institutional spending that goes on, whether it's the renovations and the reconstruction on Parliament Hill, or whether it's the work in hospitals, universities, and school boards, we are at a point where in some cases we are seeing price inflation, and we're already seeing some projects where we're having to consider whether or not we're actually getting value for the prices that are being quoted. So it will be a challenge for us as we move forward. The priorities on page, I guess it's page 4 of the memo. I'm sorry, I don't have the folio number from the agenda. We have a summary of the different PPF grants that are part of the 2021-22 budget. And in there, there's about, I think the significant items I just want to repeat is that there's about $1.2 million to support the math strategy and the changes in fundamentals. It includes the renewal of the funding for our Human Rights and Equity Advisor. It includes the renewal of funding for grad coaches for Indigenous students and for Black students. And it includes continued funding for a number of programs we've had in place, everything from apprenticeships to transportation support for children in care. Those totals come to approximately $3 million. Mr. Gardner talked about the COVID-related funding. On this page, we've only included 50%, recognizing that there is no guarantee that dollars would be provided following the first half of the year. And the province has identified a number of initiatives, additional staffing support where required. Some of that is going to obviously be used to provide the additional cleaning staff that we require, and where necessary to help cover the costs of our virtual schools. We are working on that right now with Human Resources, and we may not have a final allocation of it as we determine the budget. It may be like last year where we need the overall approval to spend, and then as the plan evolves, as we learn more from the province about their requirements, we'll be in a position to implement. Transportation is receiving an additional $1.3 million to support enhanced cleaning and where necessary to provide distancing on vehicles. That one is will be interesting to watch depending on parental choice as we return to school and as we see kids coming back to school and the use of school buses. There's additional dollars available for special ed and mental health supports, but an important number is the final one on that chart, the re-engaging students and our reading assessments. The province recognizes that there are, in fact, students that will need additional support as we move forward because of the impact of the pandemic. It really is a brief overview, Mr. Chair. There are a couple of technical pieces, though, that are important that, if I could, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about. And that has to do with our use of reserves. you will recall the board endorsed, has discussed advocating with the government that school boards should not have to have had to use all of their reserves to cover the COVID costs. What the province has identified, the grant, the specific regulation has not published yet, is that school boards that have used more than that 2% of their reserves in order to prepare for a safe return to school over the 2019-20 year, sorry, the 2020-21 year and the 2021-22 year, that in fact, the ministry upon review will be in a place to reimburse a portion of those reserves. That is a key result from the province. It's a result of a lot of work by OPSPA and by staff at various levels. We still don't know the details of it. And I think it's important to remember it's designed to reimburse for the use of reserves responding to COVID. But there is a portion of our reserve that the ministry refers to as structural, and it really does result from some of our own programs and the delta between the funding we receive and the services we provide. Having said that, it will be an item that we will be reckoning with in our staff recommended budget, and it will be part of our ongoing discussions with the province over the next year. Again, we had a discussion as recently as today with them, and we made them aware of the direction we felt we would be moving, and I didn't sense surprise or displeasure on their part. I think it's, again, it will be subject to a review at the end of the year, but I think the ministry has recognized that requiring the use of all of those reserves certainly has a negative impact on boards. And so they have signaled a willingness to work with us. And that is one of the reasons that we continue to highlight the impact of COVID on our childcare programs and on our reduced enrollment, not only our own enrollment, but our foreign student enrollment. So we will continue those discussions, and that we will have a provision for that as we bring the recommended budget forward. So I think, Chair, that's, I think I'll pause there. If there are questions on the GSN, and I know there was a lot of material that we had provided, but we wanted to give you a brief overview of this compared to where we were last year. And so you have an idea of what we're working with as we develop that recommended budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CFO. And I'm open the floor to questions. Trustee Boothby, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. My first question, I just want to follow up on that last statement around the reserves. And I'm just wondering, is the 2%, you have to have spent the 2% in each of those school years, or is it 2% cumulative?
They will be looking at each year individually, is my understanding. And we're still looking for because the grant, that part of the regulation is still outstanding. We don't know all of the details yet, but it will be designed to support boards that have had to use more than what they would otherwise have applied during the budget.
Okay, thanks for that. Back on the last page of the memo here that shows the PPF spending. I notice here under COVID related, there's 268,000 for mental health supports. Is that truly an additional, or do we know yet if that's truly an additional amount, or have we just potentially lost it somewhere else in the GSNs?
No, sorry, Chair, it hasn't been reduced from the GSNs. It has been, it is being provided in addition to those amounts. What we have to do is strategically take a look at the staffing that had previously, our academic staffing that had been approved, take a look at the admin and support and professional staff that we have been looking at recommending, and see what portion of that we would be spending normally from GSNs or from our use of reserves, and which ones will be applied against that grant. But it is an addition to the GSN.
Okay, thanks for that. Up above where it talks about the general, the $90,000 that's in there for mental health and well-being, is that the amount of money that the province announced for use over the summer, or is that additional funding as well?
No, that's a continuation of some dollars that have been floating around from last year as well. That's not the summer money.
Okay, thank you for that. Also, with the SHISM and the ASSD grant, and again, just is that actually new? Is there any new money in there, or are they just moving it into the GSNs so that we have more certainty of year over year that we're going to be able to do a certain amount of SHISMs and ASSDs?
Chair, it's not an addition or a reduction. It's essentially the same. We've been looking at the calculations and working it through. It's simply embedding it in the GSN.
Okay, does that in any way limit our ability then to bring on board new SHISMs?
It shouldn't, Chair. I haven't looked at the, we haven't worked it through, but I'm not aware of any changes in the guidelines from the province.
Okay, because I think before we had to apply for each SHISM that we wanted.
And I believe those rules are still in place, but this change simply modified where the funding was being applied, but I'm not aware that there have been any program changes. We still are required to apply, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is, again, under that general funding, there's a category called OSSTF Ed Workers Apprenticeship. I'm just wondering what that is.
Chair, under the previous collective agreement, and then under this one, there were opportunities for the board and in our case, PSSU, to work together to identify an apprenticeship program. And so in addition to, we have worked with the Federation over the last 4 or 5 years, and we have been able to support the OCDSB employing and supervising apprentices in the trades. I know at least one was an auto mechanic. We've had a couple of electricians. And so this is continuation of that funding.
Okay, and is that directly tied to the collective bargaining agreements then? And might it not be continued outside the next collective bargaining?
Chair, we had prior to this, we had included in our own budget funding. I think we had two apprenticeships that we would manage within our own complement. And so depending on changes down the road, we'd always take a look at the mix of funding, but it has proven to be effective to date. And so it is something we hope we would be able to continue, be able to find dollars for. And at the moment, we're not aware that any of those provincial dollars are at risk.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you very much. And is there any further questions on the grant announcements for CFO Carson? And seeing no further questions, let's move on to information items. And the first one is agenda item 5.1, memo 21-061, update on 2021-2022 OCDSB budget items, priorities, school resource officers, and I'm call upon the director to introduce this item.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. And so we will recall that probably 2 budget cycles ago, reiterated in the last budget cycle, there had been a question raised by trustees around the allocation of a specific line item supporting priority school resource officers for 2 of our secondary schools. Subsequent to that time, and as committed to trustees, we have undertaken a review that will inform how it is we bring forward our staff recommended budget pertaining to that particular line item. Superintendent Farish has been the lead on this item, and so I will ask her to speak to the memo as it pertains to the budget piece. So Superintendent Farish, please.
Thank you very much, Director Williams-Taylor, and through you, Chair. I'm happy to take questions. I will maybe highlight a few pieces of the memo that you have, just to really provide the rationale for why the memo was coming at this stage. Again, just to support any questions or interest that might be out there around the preparation of our staff recommended budget. We wanted to provide this piece of information for you so that you have that available. And then, of course, the information is that we are going to discontinue the investment that has been made over the past years through the Memorandum of Understanding, which amounts to a contribution towards 2 priority SROs. And those SROs, if you recall, they were they were serving, 2 high schools and those high schools feeder schools. So that's something that we are, that you won't see in the budget line going forward, is that investment in the Memorandum of Understanding. However, we do look at that investment in from a total sum to include the amount, the contribution from Ottawa Police Service as well. So you'll notice that the amount of approximately $200,000 is there, and that I signal that you will see more details that come along with all the details that come when we start to present the recommended budget and the expenditures that are there. So you will see how we are working to continue to support the group of schools in ways that are aligned with the roadmap goals and also our strategic plan goal areas in all 3 of the cultures. Just a reminder that at this stage, we are working towards providing you with a full report. It's a review of police involvement in schools, of our practices in involving police in schools. And so this is a piece of that, so you'll see more information about this piece in the report that will come. We anticipate that's going to be in June, and then going forward, we're looking at revising the policy as per the trustee memo from September. So the fall would see us into the stage of revising the policy itself. And just wanted to let you know that we have communicated with the school council. Both of the high schools and the school councils are aware that that decision has been made, and we look forward to working with the schools to find the best way to invest in that group of schools.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Farish, for that memo. And I guess we do have some questions on the memo. Trustee Lyra, go ahead.
I'd like to thank staff for bringing this forwards. I would like to know if there are any other line items that exist where the school board is putting money into OPS or other police services that might not have been this particular line item.
Through you, Chair, to my knowledge, we do not have any other line items, but certainly I would defer to CFO Carson to confirm that.
Your Superintendent Farish is correct.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And student trustee Liu.
So I'm really glad to hear about this sort of withdrawal of investment in response to the community feedback received. My question is, does this mean that these two SROs will cease to exist? Because clearly the OPS is still funding them. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, when it comes to, students on the ground, does this change, the presence of these two SROs in particular?
Thank you for the question, and through you, Chair. It's difficult for me to speak at all to decisions that Ottawa Police Service make in terms of the way that they allocate staff in the way that they run different programs. So the SRO program is theirs. The staff that they operate it, they make decisions about how to utilize that particular position and role. So I don't think I can tell you what happens to those two individuals in terms of the people who are fulfilling those roles. But what I can tell you is that there will not be the service in the way that the schools had been experiencing police involvement through those two positions. There are other SRO positions, as you mentioned, and at this stage, we are still in the process of creating the review, looking at all of the consultation feedback, along with the research and the literature and the other district reports. And so we will probably be in a better position to speak more fully once that report is available for discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. And my questions are for the director. So I just want to be clear. So in my zone, I'm aware that all of my schools have an SRO assigned to them. Is that your understanding, Madam Director?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Just to be clear, so in this particular circumstance, we were addressing the budget item around the designated SRO program.
No, I understand
point of view
that.
Yeah, so I'm just going to circle back to your point. From the point of view of the SRO program in general, my understanding is, and probably AD Reynolds has a better scope of understanding, but the SRO program serves not only multiple schools across the district, it also serves multiple schools across Ottawa. So it also engages the other 3 school boards as well. And so through the program that the Ottawa Police Service runs, they do assign SROs to different groupings of schools, of which I'm quite confident that Barrhaven would be amongst them. Yeah. In terms of exactly which schools, again, AD Reynolds probably has a better handle on that than I do, but I do know that it is a program that supports a range of schools.
Thank you, Madam Director. And I don't need to hear from AD Reynolds. I am very familiar with the program and have actually met with the SROs who do serve my schools. I guess what I'm trying to get at is this memo in no way changes the fact that there will be an SRO assigned to Gloucester and Ridgemont and the 7 feeder schools. So in other words, it doesn't make sense that all the other schools in the district would have an SRO assigned to them, but these particular schools wouldn't. So can I get some clarification on that? And I'd prefer the answer from the director, please.
Well, I will start the answer for you, Trustee Blackburn, and I will turn it to Superintendent Farish for some backup, because again, the details, the devil is in the details, as we know. And so what this does speak to is the a partnered agreement for a designated SRO for 2 specific schools. And so the services provided by this community policing project or program are more concentrated for these particular schools. And that is what we're talking about here, that would not be designated any further. That's a different conversation than the conversation about the support for those schools, all of the schools in general. Because the designated SRO program, we would be moving away from the partnership around that designated piece. It does not mean necessarily that there wouldn't be service or partnership to continue if it is that, you know, Gloucester or Ridgemont or any other school called upon an SRO through this decision. That said, just as Superintendent Farish has indicated, this is one decision that pertains to a budget question. The other information, there is a report that's coming in June about the full consultation process that was undertaken. And so any further discussions about the relationship with the SRO program as a whole would be coming through that process, not through this one tonight. So it is a bit preemptive for us to speak to that, because the report isn't even completed. And so that is coming back to trustees in June for discussion with a next steps conversation.
So let's say that the board agrees with this recommendation, right? Will there be an SRO at Gloucester and Ridgemont and the other feeder schools? I'm not talking about the designated one. I'm talking about an SRO that's assigned to the school. I'm not talking about whatever it's called, a priority school resource officer. I'm just talking about a school resource officer.
So I'll say to you that this decision pertaining to the budget and the memorandum of understanding does not change that arrangement. But I don't want to present a representation that there will not be a change going forward in the fall. This situation is addressing the budget piece, and so it will not change that arrangement for the time being.
Okay, because we do have a board motion that I've pulled up that the board passed, and it says, therefore be it resolved that the board review policy PO43.SCO, police involvement in schools, 1 and number 2 is all OCDSB commitments identified as legally discretionary within the multilateral protocol governing the area school and police relations. So it seems that staff are preempting the decision. The board, I mean, I've got a 2-page memo, which isn't really 2 pages because half of the first page is the logo and who it's from and where it's going. I don't have the information and the decision's already been made. So in any other circumstance, certain of my colleagues would be very wary of staff making a decision about a program that's under review, that we haven't got the data on, and you've already made a decision about this, and it's very problematic. And I see your hand, Superintendent Farish, and you and I have had a long discussion. It wasn't a public discussion, and I'm not going to rehash it because I'm not interested in having a hamster wheel discussion. But I find this very problematic. It sets a bad precedent. The board passed a motion to review this program. We don't have a lot of information other than kind of, you know, what some people are saying. I don't know how good the data is, and I'm very disappointed that in my personal opinion, staff has disrespected a board motion in this particular case.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, if I may respond, we actually are carrying out the direction from the board motion, which is the very robust report that will be coming forward. The reason that we're bringing this forward in the budget conversation is that the request for a designated school resource officer for 2 particular schools came through many years ago as essentially an operational move, which was a decision or a request through staff. This is a decision, this is a budget item that was raised in budget last year as well as the year before about the allocation of funds for a particular program. And so based on the feedback that we've received thus far, one of the things that has come forward to us is at this point, we wanted to make sure that we in fact honored the concern that trustees had raised about the fact that we are directing funds to engagement with police. And based on what we have learned thus far, we have indicated for the purpose of this discussion that we will not be including that line item as a part of our staff recommended budget. It is indeed a staff recommended budget. If it is that there are, the purpose of these conversations is for trustees to discuss, debate, ask questions, redirect around the staff recommended budget. And that's what the next series of meetings are coming from. But we wanted to honor the fact that trustees had made it very clear that an interrogation of this particular line item was expected. And so we wanted to reflect that we in fact have done that, but we are following up with the rest of the resolution and the direction coming up in June, as well as in the fall, pertaining to the policy question that is at hand.
Thank you very much for that excellent description, Madam Director. Moving on to Trustee Campbell, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you very much. In fact, I believe that was me, perhaps amongst other trustees, who had asked staff if we get perhaps a preliminary taste of some direction in for the purpose of the budget discussion around this time, way back when those conversations were had, and so I am thankful to staff that they have leaned into it. I guess my take is I'll be honest, and I think perhaps to staff's point, if in general budget debate, trustee wanted to move reinstatement of a line item, that's certainly a debate topic. But I guess my takeaway from reading the memo, for what it's worth, is if staff had recommended continuance for one more year because they were not yet sure that the schools could be adequately supported in the ways that the positive ways in which SROs may contribute, maybe an alternate personnel, alternate funding arrangements, whatever. If staff were not yet, study hadn't been completed, staff were not yet confident and had recommended continuance, I'd probably have accepted that. I take it that staff have done analysis and that the designated SRO is a very high level of service, a very concentrated level of service. At least in that respect, I'm gathering that staff are of the belief that services can be replaced if and as appropriate, and that students continue to be served. So I guess I was open to either personally, and it's interesting to me as to where staff has come out on this. The regular SRO and the MOU and the protocol, of course, are all related but different matters, and this is a budgetary item. Anyway, that's just my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Campbell. Moving on to Trustee Ellis.
Thank you, and thank you for this work. I'm glad to see this recommendation, and I view it from an equity lens. One needs to question why these particular two schools. And I think if one examines it, one can't help but come to the conclusion that there are biases brought to bear on this. So I thank you for removing these priority positions. Look forward to having a full debate about the SRO program when our consultation is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Ellis. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on this, in terms of the $95,000, was that money that was coming out of the general funds Or was that money that was specifically coming out of the priority schools grants that Gloucester and Ridgemont continued to receive?
Ask CFO Carson to address that question, because I'm not, or I see that Superintendent Barrett has opened her mic. So perhaps I'll turn it to Superintendent Barrett.
Thank you, through you, Chair. This answer won't be as masterful as CFO Carson's, but I have consulted with CFO Carson about this. So thank you for the question. So from the inception of the actual funding arrangement or the memorandum of understanding, there have been a few different ways that it has been financed from our perspective. Currently, and since 2012, I may be corrected on that, Manager Gardner may say that, it has come out of the central funds. It has not come out of the Urban Priorities grant. So the Urban Priority High School funding that comes has not been used for allocation towards the SRO. And again, the 95,000 isn't one full position. It's a contribution that we make towards 2 positions. And that's really why it's hard for us to be able to answer what the outcome of this break of the memorandum of understanding means for OPS.
Thank you very much for that answer. My concern was just to make sure that if it was part of the urban priorities funding that was being used, that it stayed as part of that the $95,000 that was freed up stayed as part of the urban priorities funding and could be used for something else. But if it was coming out of the general coffers of the OCDSB, then it still can be used for something else if we are not spending it on as our contribution to having the additional SRO support for those 2 schools. And presumably then the OPS has its own arrangement of how they group schools and how many SROs they have overall across the city, and they have I believe a responsibility under their current arrangements to cover all the schools with some kind of SRO support. And if these 2 schools are part of that and they're feeder schools, that will presumably continue in some form. But what the OPS decides to do about it is really up to the OPS at this point. Have I got that more or less straight? And I'm seeing nodding heads from staff. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. And seeing no further hands up, I'd like to thank you for that item, Madam Director, and that good discussion addressed to the trustees. So moving on to, in our agenda, to item number 5, scheduled committee of the whole budget meetings. I just want to note that on June 1st, CFO Carson has the privilege and the honor of presenting the OCDSB staff recommended budget on that evening. And then following that on June 9th, there are public delegations as well as a budget debate. And that continues, if necessary, on June 15th. And we're looking for board approval either after that meeting or on the 21st, depending upon how it goes. We have to remain a bit flexible with that. And I think Mr. Gardner presented that schedule in the slides as well. So given nothing else, it doesn't look like information items or new business was on this agenda as approved. So that leads to the adjournment of this meeting, and we'll see everyone on June the 1st at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, did
Yes.
we actually have an opportunity for new business to be raised?
Normally I would, however, we approved the agenda and there was no new business items on it. At least
New
on mine.
business is on the agenda. New business information and inquiries is on the agenda.
I
Item 6,
apologize.
on the agenda.
I apologize on my, okay, let's do that. Okay. Is there any new business? And seeing no new business, thank you very much. And so I'd like to call the meeting adjourned.